Welcome back and thanks for being with us here on Morning Live. Now, the first part of the state capture report was officially handed over to President Ramaphosa by the Commission's chairperson, Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, yesterday. Zondo announced that the second part of the report would be submitted to the President at the end of the month and the final submission will be made at the end of February. Now, the report is categorized into three parts, with part one consisting of 3 volumes which focus on South African Airways, the New Age and South African Revenue Services. Now, among some of the findings contained in the first part of the report are Transnet's sponsorship of the SABC's New Age TNA business breakfast for millions of rands between 2011 and 2017, and that was found to be irregular. Now, it also found that there was a massive failure of integrity and governance at South African Revenue Service, that's SARS, making adverse finding against the former SARS Commissioner Tom Moyane, with one of the recommendations being that Moyane be charged with perjury in relation to giving false evidence to Parliament. The State Capture Commission was, of course, established in 2018 by former President Jacob Zuma following recommendations that were made by the then Public Protector, Advocate Thuli Madonsela, who joins us now for a little bit of a discussion about these latest developments. Advocate or Professor Madonsela, good morning and thanks so much for speaking to us. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Sakina. Happy New Year to the viewers. Thank you for the privilege.
So, firstly, it's been a long time coming. The Commission has been sitting for a number of years now. But, you know, just looking at yesterday's developments, given that it was your state of capture report or during your tenure as the head of that particular institution, that is the Public Protector's Office, that actually paved the way for the State Capture Commission to be instituted. What are your sentiments at this stage?
Well, yesterday was a game-changing day in so far as the narrative on state capture is concerned. The Commission has confirmed that the word state capture. I also think that it is possibly a new chapter in our democracy where we look carefully at the people we put in power and where the public stays engaged as part of social accountability to make sure that democracy is not hijacked. And in this regard, we're grateful firstly to the chairperson of the Commission, Acting Chief Justice Zondo, for the work, but more importantly, grateful to the President for making the report available to everyone so that there's social accountability. Everyone has their own understanding of what its contents are, and everyone positions themselves to play a part in the next chapter.
Professor Madonsela, any comments on the process that has been undertaken so far?
I don't want to comment on the process because every investigator approaches things their way. I teach investigations. I have a particular approach, but I respect that the Commission took an approach that made sense to it, and grateful that at least we have part of the product.
Now, I'm sure you are aware, because it has been said many a time in public, Professor Madonsela, former President Jacob Zuma, often arguing that the initial steps into the formation of the Commission were flawed in that he did not appoint the judge, but that it was done by the Chief Justice at your behest. Now, do you think that those claims are valid, and would that not dent the Commission's integrity in any way in terms of how things have ultimately panned out?
Sakina, with due respect to former President Jacob Zuma, he's being dishonest. He appointed the Public Protector, this very last one, on the recommendation of Parliament. Would he approach the public then and say, he didn't appoint the Public Protector? And if he can't do that, what's the difference? But having said that, President Zuma changed fundamentally the terms of reference of this commission of inquiry. And as a result, it's taken us 4 years, loss of evidence, loss of time, loss of money, and of course, loss of trust in the process. You will recall that the commission that was ordered, not recommended, ordered by the Public Protector and endorsed by a court of law had a very narrow focus. It was just looking at whether or not the Minister of Finance, firstly, was fired with the influence of the Gupta family, and if this was part of a broader systemic capture of the state and repurposing it for the business interests of companies that are co-owned by the then president's son and the Zuma family. And whether this extended throughout the state, affecting how ministers were appointed in strategic portfolios, how they were fired, appointment of DGs, appointment of boards and CEOs of SOEs, etc. So that's all that we were supposed to do based on the original whistleblowing by SABC Jonas, and then followed by Temba Maseko, Vici Mentor, and many others. So if we had done the investigation that was ordered by the Public Protector and endorsed by a court of law, this process would have been shorter. But Sakina, we also gained something in this broader process. If you look at the report that was issued yesterday, the eyes have been cast quite wide in such a way that we have been made aware of a whole lot of rot, and we're now in a position to get rid of it.
And to that point, the public has been questioning, the cost of the commission. And as you pointed out just a short while ago, whereas the initial intent was to have a very narrow mandate and scope for this particular commission, it was expanded. So it was intended to take around 6 months. It's been extended 4 times, coming in at a reported cost of around R1 billion or more. Do you believe that that is worth it? I know your final sentiments and your final point, but overall, do you think that it's been worth it and value for money for the country?
Well, firstly, it was wrong that the terms were expanded because some of the evidence will be lost. But, Sakina, you're right. It's been worth it in a sense that there's more we've discovered through this kitchen sink approach than we would have discovered had we stayed with a focused, precise investigation.
With that said, though, if we look at, many a report, many a investigation, inquiry and reports handed over to Parliament, to various departments, even reports coming from your previous office, the Public Protector's Office. And if we look at the track record as South Africa of actually implementing recommendations from various reports, do you think that we ought to be optimistic at this point as South Africa? Because where to from now in terms of making sure that those recommendations are in fact implemented and those who are fingered in wrongdoing are actually made to account?
We certainly ought to be optimistic. Firstly, most of the major reports that I issued as Public Protector were implemented. One of them is the directive that a commission of inquiry be appointed. Hence, we had its first report yesterday. Regarding what happens after this, the president has promised us that there will be implementation, and I have no reason to doubt him. Secondly, by giving the report to the public immediately and encouraging the media like you to unpack it for the public, that is encouraging social accountability, which means me, you, and everyone else now has a duty to ensure accountability for the implementation of the findings of the Zondo Commission.
So, of course, that first part of the report being made public yesterday, late afternoon, I'm not sure how much time you've had to peruse through all of it. It's quite lengthy, 870-odd pages, Advocate Madonsela. But looking at that, is there anything that particularly stood out for you, anything of particular interest that you may have read already?
I'm really caught between two worlds. The fact that I'm an academic and I did read the report last night, and also the fact that I was the person who ordered that this commission be established. And therefore, because of the latter, I choose not to comment, just to commend the commission for doing a great job. And secondly, to encourage the public to engage with the report, which does confirm that there was state capture and gives us the modus operandi and the impact on these areas of the state that have been dealt with. The new age, which hounded me, and at that stage I didn't know that the new age was co-owned by the Zumas and the Guptas. And of course, members of the public didn't know. So whatever the new age said about me and my office was taken as media and just general accountability. And we only discovered during the investigation the shareholding in the new age. So the report at least deals with how the new age was funded, among other things. And of course, the SAA is one area where the public blames the SAA people and doesn't even want to use the SAA. And I think out of respect for the men and women that work at the SAA and that work very hard and professionally, we should now use the SAA, realizing that it wasn't their fault that things went downstream. And of course, there's SARS, and a lot of it is in the public domain.
Now, as you say, Advocate Professor Madonsela, the inquiry was to establish whether, in fact, there was state capture. I think you titled it allegations into allegations of state capture. But of course, from what we've read in the report already, it does establish that there was, in fact, state capture. To that point, just in terms of how wide and how far the repercussions will run, how do we as a country, move forward from this? Because if indeed the rot and the corruption is as systemic and endemic as the public believes it is, how do we turn the situation around?
Well, firstly, we need to read the report of this commission and pay attention to the recommendations and close the fault lines that enabled the rot that occurred. Secondly, it's not going to be possible to deal with this state capture with finality without the final report. You've just said, Sakina, that the investigation was to look at whether or not there was state capture. And in the investigation that I ordered, the sequence was different. It was firstly the firing of the Minister of Finance and whether the Guptas were involved in this and whether this was in order to prepare way for the state to be easily repurposed to facilitate the interests of businesses that were and are still co-owned by the former president's son and the Guptas. And lastly, whether this extended to the hiring and firing of ministers, DGs, and CEOs and boards of SOEs. So we still don't have that full story. In my provisional report, or sort of Section 979 notice to President Zuma, we had a narrative that indicated how it all started And I won't say it now. I will want to wait for the final report to see whether they've captured how this was enabled from the starting of the relationship between President Zuma and the Guptas and their relationship with his son and the business interests of these two families and how this then became a pattern within the state. Until we get that, we will not have the formula for how to prevent this kind of capture from happening in the future.
But also just with regard to the shortcomings of the state in this regard. And of course, even this first part of the report speaks to that in quite a bit of detail. But the point, Professor Madonsela, about the lack of civil action, as an example, against those who have been fingered previously, the lack of action from the NPA side in terms of prosecutions, those surely are worrying for the South African public, because one would have thought that in one way or another, there should have been greater effort to make sure that the money that was looted from state coffers be returned.
Some of it has been returned. For example, regiment capital is mentioned again in this report in relation to another SOE, but where it was mentioned in relation to other SOEs previously, it was made accountable, and the money that was paid to Regiment, Trillion, and Mackenzie was returned. And there's more money that has been returned that was looted via state capture. And that was not due to the commission per se, but it was due to these other parallel investigations and the work of investigative journalists. And therefore, we shouldn't lose heart. Some of the money will be returned, but because this process was made to be a kitchen sink approach, which then made it too wide, we will not get most of the money. In fact, most of the money has been spent and siphoned out of the country into accounts overseas and maybe laundered in various ways. So we won't get all of the money, but in return, we're getting a broader viewpoint about what's rotting in the state and how do we, as citizens and as people who want democracy not to be hijacked.
Well, this is true, and you juxtapose that, against a public that is cash-strapped. If you take a narrow example of Eskom, for example, where it seems that, the ability to procure electricity is becoming astronomical for ordinary South Africans, in part due to the state capture project. People would want to say, get the money back so that we don't have to pay for it. But we are out of time, Advocate Madonsela. And as you say, once the entire report is released, please, let's have another chat. But just something you mentioned about the New Age and the Guptas, didn't they once award you Person of the Year award or something? And what do you think of that now?
I think it was part of the capture project, but there I was not really understanding what was going on. But an interesting fact happened there. As soon as I was awarded 100,000 rand, the following day, and I managed Sakina, the following day they wanted my private bank account to put that money in. And I said to my team, no, I didn't work for this money. We need to establish a trust for the organization and put the money in. And after dealing with the auditors and everyone else, eventually we couldn't appoint a trust, but we were assisted by Treasury to open an account, and all of that money went in. And I remember my children saying, Mommy, the swimming pool needs some money. And I said, no, this is not my money. This is money that belongs to the people. But I do now see a whole lot of things that happened during my term that were a dance between an attempt to capture me and then also a pushback. I also do think that this capture went right into the office, and I do remember some of my staff members dancing with the new age, one of them even at some stage being covered with something so that we couldn't recognize it, but it was very easy to recognize, and making a big issue out of something, out of our kindness. We created a cohort that was called trainee investigators, and now making us the monsters that were not turning the trainee investigators into full-time investigators. But all of that worked well because then we created a post of assistant investigator. You know, when you mine the duality of adversity, things eventually go right.
Professor Madonsela, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Former Public Protector, Professor Thuli Madonsela, reflecting on the handing over of the first part of the State Capture Commission report to President Ramaphosa yesterday by the chairperson of the Commission.